Technological innovations in land warfare, the machine gun and rapid-fire artillery, led to the unspeakable horror of trench warfare in World War I. Some far-sighted military officers realized that the best antidotes to these innovations were other technological innovations. Armor was needed to protect the soldier from enemy firepower. Mobility was needed to overcome the stalemate of trench warfare. And guns were needed to overpower enemy defenses. In France, it was General Estienne.
To begin with, we must remember that there was a great general, General Estienne. He founded the first tank units, called the assault artillery, with a few vehicles, some Schneider and some Saint-Chamond tanks. The Schneider was introduced for the first time on the 16th of April, 1917. This was the first appearance of French tanks on the battlefield. It was not a success because the Allies were not coordinated. The British used their tanks first and we did later, with the result that it was not what we hoped for. But General Estienne was a man of strong character, and he said that's life.
Mais le général Estienne était un homme de caractère et il s'est dit, c'est l'avenir.
Curiously enough, on the German side, General Ludendorff didn't believe in tanks at all. He thought these are just moving tin cans and they burn too easily. But the French persisted and built over 200 Schneider and over 200 Saint-Chamond. The Saint-Chamond was revolutionary at the time because it was armed with a powerful French 75mm gun, the 75, and it used electrical propulsion. This was quite new at the time. Even today, people come to see how this tank was built.
The first French tanks, the Schneiders, entered combat several months after the first British tanks. By the time of the 1917 battle on the Chemin des Dames, the German artillery was ready for them. The results of the first French tank attacks were tragic. General Estienne had foreseen this problem and was developing a new concept in tanks with the Renault Automobile Company. Instead of small numbers of large lumbering tanks like the Schneiders, Saint-Chamond, or the British tanks, he advocated large numbers of very small tanks.
The driving force behind their development was really General Jean-B. Estienne, who played such a key role in the interwar period also. He really saw the tank as a artillerie d'assaut in the sense of assault artillery. And he saw it as being a vehicle that carried firepower along with the infantry to assist them in the movement on the battlefield. The role that he played was really very similar to that of some of the key British innovators in the sense of having the concept and then moving forward with it. And in fact, the French worked at about the same pace as the British, but they were sort of initially behind in the sense of when they started. But once they got started, they initially tried some of the larger vehicles that were really designed to break through the enemy fortifications, and then moved toward some of the lighter armored vehicles, particularly the FT-17, which was intended to be used to break through the enemy fortifications, but not in the same sense that the heavy tanks were to be used. But from the beginning, they saw many more tanks being on the battlefield than the British. They emphasized a smaller tank so it would be more mobile, employed more flexibly perhaps than what the British had envisioned in their ideas. But certainly they spent a lot of time thinking about it and they were in fact very successful with the vehicles and the ideas that they developed in World War I.
The Renault FT pioneered the classic layout of all modern tanks. Its most significant innovation was the use of a fully traversing turret. The driver sat in the front of the vehicle, the commander in the turret, and the engine at the rear. The Renault FT entered combat in 1918, and several thousand were manufactured. They also formed the basis for the first American tank battalions, led by a young American colonel named George S. Patton. The Renault FT became the most widely used tank of the 1920s, also forming the basis of the early tank forces of Russia, Japan, and China. The success of the Renault FT was not without its drawbacks.
From the beginning, the French saw the tank as an important vehicle. If you look into the interwar period, they also emphasized the tank and its importance during that period. But one of the most important factors in how they developed the tank was all of the tanks that they had left over from World War I. Specifically, they had several thousand of the FT-17s, which was a very slow vehicle, a very small vehicle, moved at about 5 miles an hour, slightly faster than the average infantryman. Because of the existence of those vehicles, it was very difficult for the French to conceive of something dramatically different. Each time those who were in charge of developing French tanks saw this very fragile, very slow, very vulnerable vehicle, it was difficult for them to think of something that would be dramatically different. So consequently, you see, in terms of concept, the existence of those several thousands of tanks was very, very important to the ultimate doctrine, the ultimate equipment that they devised.
In the 1920s, France continued to experiment with innovative tanks, including massive breakthrough tanks and even amphibious tanks. But it was the FT that made up most of the force. In the 1930s, the French army saw the need for two distinctly different types of tanks: a small infantry tank like the Renault FT, and a larger, more powerful battle tank.
From the beginning, they saw two fundamentally different types of tanks. One was the heavy tank, the battle tank, which was the favorite vehicle of General Estienne, who dominated the development of French army in the interwar period, and the other was the lighter infantry tank. The heavier tank was designed to be the breakthrough tank. It would be the tank that would meet the enemy fortifications, the enemy defenses first. And then behind that would be the lighter tank that would be moving at the pace of the infantry. Once you start out with that concept, that pretty much rules, in the French view, what type of tank you devise. If you are devising a breakthrough tank, then what you want is something that is very heavy, something that has a lot of firepower, something that can be protected from the anti-tank defenses of the infantry. In that case, the Char B1B and the Char B1 fit that perfectly, because that tank had heavy armament, anywhere from 50 to 60 millimeters of protection on the front slope. It had a very heavy main gun. It had a number of machine guns that could all be used in concert with one another to suppress enemy fire, break through the enemy fortifications, and open the hole that could then be penetrated with the light infantry tanks and the infantry itself.
The Char B battle tank was the most powerful tank of the 1930s. It was armed with an impressive array of weapons: a 75mm gun mounted on the front hull and a 47mm anti-tank gun mounted in the turret.
C'est certain que le char B1 bis a été le char lourd de l'armée française.
In 1935, the Char B1 became the heavy tank of the French army. It was first used in 1940. As with any other equipment, there were strong points and weak points. Its main asset was its weapons. As you can see, there was a 47mm gun mounted in the turret, and of course, a 75mm howitzer located between the tracks.
Un obusier de 75 situé entre les chenilles. Il faut se souvenir pourquoi ce char et pourquoi il a été influencé par nos tacticiens.
Why was this tank designed, you might ask? It's very simple. The war might be fought against the German Siegfried Line. The howitzer was used to destroy hardened targets on the battlefield, to demolish steel obstacles, dragon's teeth, and pillboxes. It could also be used for indirect fire, since often the normal artillery wasn't there.
The light infantry tanks followed the same basic pattern as the Renault FT, but with thicker armor. 3 different types were built in the 1930s due to the large quantities needed to replace the old FT. These included the Renault 35, the Hotchkiss 35 and 39, and the FCM 36. Like the old FT, they were slow infantry support tanks, intended to fight enemy infantry and machine gun nests, not to fight enemy tanks. One of the finest tanks to emerge from France in this period was the Sommois S-35 cavalry tank. In the early 1930s, the French cavalry began to mechanize, giving up their horses for new armored mounts. The Sommois cavalry tank was well armored, fast, and very well armed. It had a unique role to play in France's military preparations for war with Germany.
If you look at the French war plans in the interwar period, you will find that they intended to use their cavalry primarily up in the Belgian area, in the famous Gimblou Gap. That cavalry would have to be highly mobile. It would have to have a great deal of firepower to slow down the German attacks, but it would have to be something that could be moved immediately from the area of France upward into Belgium, into the Gimblou Gap area. So consequently, the type of tank that you use must be very mobile. It must have a gun that will defeat any German armor that you may have. It must be a tank that is very reliable. It is a tank that is immediately responsive in many, many ways. And that's exactly what the Sommois S-35 became. It, in fact, was probably the best tank on the battlefield in 1940 because it was very mobile, it had good cruising range, it had highly effective weapons, and it had very good armor protection.
When France and Germany went to war in 1940, the French army seemed to hold the advantage. France had more tanks, and their technological qualities were much superior. Better armor, better guns. But France was defeated in a campaign that shocked the world. The French weakness was doctrine, not technology. The German army developed a method of mobile warfare, sometimes called blitzkrieg, which made best use of the strong points of tanks. The French doctrine, called methodical battle, could not cope with the German tactics.
It seems to me it goes back to the question of doctrine, primarily because given the emphasis on the methodical battle, the French really did not see a need for a great deal of training in terms of moving units rapidly from one spot to another, training units to respond to the unexpected. Their emphasis was on the expected, to do as they were told, to respond the way the higher level commander told them to respond, and that's what they trained their subordinates to do. But given that sort of approach to battle, there really was no need for a lot of radios. You could always run landlines, you could always use some sort of telephones to communicate with higher headquarters. If nothing else, you could use flares, you could use hand signals, but you did not need a lot of radios. As a result of that, they had practically no radios in their tanks, in their command vehicles at all. But the reason for that goes back to the doctrinal explanation, in the sense of because they had their doctrine, because they had that concept for how units would be employed, they simply did not value the use of radios very much at all. The sort of things that they practiced were carefully controlled movements, the movement from one point to another point, or phase line to phase line, something that did not require a great deal of skill, something that did not require a great deal of experience. So the French army was prepared to perform according to its doctrine in a fashion that the French military leadership thought would be effective. Unfortunately, that preparation was not the preparation that they needed to respond to the very rapid, sharp, decisive actions of German tanks when German tanks came into those key encounter areas.
French tank design remained influential even after the defeat. The American M3 Lee tank was patterned after the Shah B-1, with its main gun in the hull and its anti-tank gun in the turret. The layout and configuration of the Sommois S-35 helped inspire the M4 Sherman tank, the mainstay of the United States tank force during World War II. The 1940 defeat did not signal the end of the French armored force. The young commander of the 4th Armored Division, Charles de Gaulle, re-established the Free French forces in Britain. The new French armored force was equipped with American armor, the M4 Sherman tank, the M10 tank destroyer, and the M8 Greyhound scout car. Every summer, the parade grounds of the French Cavalry School at Saumur in the Loire Valley witness a reminder of the history of French tanks during the war. The M10, named Scirocco, has a particularly proud story behind it. In 1944, Scirocco served with the most famous of the French units, General Leclerc's 2nd Armored Division, during the liberation of Paris. During the fighting for the capital, Scirocco engaged in a duel with a German Panther tank on the Place de la Concorde in the heart of Paris. The Panther was the most formidable tank on the battlefield in 1944. During the duel on the Place de la Concorde, Scirocco emerged victorious. Scirocco was manned by volunteers from the French Navy, evident in the naval cap worn by the crew during the annual Saumur Review. In the years immediately after the war, the French Army relied on American armored vehicles until French industries could be rebuilt. The M47 Patton tank was the mainstay of the French tank force through much of the 1950s. In the early 1950s, France was involved in a protracted and bloody conflict in a region of the world that would become all too familiar to Americans a decade later. France tried to re-establish colonial rule in Indochina after the war, but was resisted by the Viet Minh guerrillas. The war in Indochina was not well suited to tanks. But the French forces used tanks to patrol roads and support the infantry. Probably the most famous use of tanks took place in the final months of the war, when 4 of these M24 Chaffee tanks were airlifted into the besieged garrison of Dien Bien Phu in a last-ditch effort to save the situation. The hopeless struggle at Dien Bien Phu marked an unhappy climax to the French role in Indochina. French designers in the late 1940s attempted to re-establish their reputation as innovators in armored vehicle design. One of the most successful designs in armored cars during the period was the Panhard EBR. The Panhard design was begun in 1940, interrupted by the war, and restarted after 1945. The EBR was designed for scouting, not for fighting. It had a driver facing both directions. When it located an enemy force, the controls were switched from one driver to the other, allowing the EBR to withdraw and report on its discoveries. The wheels in the center of the vehicle could be lowered when traversing soft ground to give the EBR additional traction. Wheeled armored vehicle design became a hallmark of post-war French armored vehicle development. Many French wheeled armored vehicles followed the EBR. Their success was marked by their widespread export around the world, to the Mideast, Africa, Asia, and South America. The most impressive and successful light tank of the 1950s was the AMX-13. The designers modified the powerful 75mm gun used on the wartime 45-ton German Panther tank and incorporated it on a much smaller 15-ton tank. To keep the tank small, the designers fitted it with an automatic loader for the gun in the rear of the turret. The AMX-13 was the first tank to use such a system, and they are only now becoming common on other tanks. The first successful French battle tank of the post-war years was the AMX-30. The AMX-30 design pioneered the smooth-bore tank gun. Conventional tank guns are rifled, imparting a spin in the projectile as it's fired down the tube. This presented a problem with new anti-tank munitions such as shaped charge rounds. The French designers were the first to surmount the technical problems with smooth-bore guns, resulting in the 105mm gun on the AMX-30. In recent years, smooth-bore guns have become standard on main battle tanks around the world, including the German Leopard 2 and the American M1A1 Abrams. The AMX-30 still serves with the French tank force in the improved AMX-30B2 version. The AMX-30B2 incorporates many new features, including a highly effective thermal imaging night sight. The AMX-30B2 thermal sight allows the gunner to rapidly locate enemy tanks in complete darkness, or even when the target is obscured by smoke. Here we see what the tank gunner in the AMX-30B2 sees when he engages targets at night. The AMX-30 has proved to be a versatile vehicle suitable for other roles. A self-propelled artillery version has been built on the chassis, called the GCT 155mm. The latest developments in tank technology are incorporated in the new AMX Leclerc main battle tank, which will enter service in the 1990s. The Leclerc comes nearly a decade after its nearest counterparts, the American M1 Abrams and the German Leopard 2.
The main improvements of the past 10 years in the second generation of tanks have been improvements in technology, computerization, and communications. There are also great improvements in the combat characteristics, such as mobility, firepower, and protection. But the most significant changes, which lead us to call the Leclerc a third-generation tank, is in its ability to be integrated into a computerized system for the command and control of entire tank units.
One of the unique aspects of the Leclerc is the ability of its digital onboard computer to automatically communicate with other tanks in the unit and with its higher headquarters.
La chose est difficile à décrire. La capacité du Leclerc de s'intégrer dans un système de commandement, c'est...
It's difficult to describe such a system. First of all, it's a communication network. The tank can send or receive digital data, for example, to receive its battle orders or other information. It continuously sends data and its location to the upper echelons, and so it's possible for the headquarters to plan and conduct the battle, making the best use of each tank's capabilities.
En exploitant au mieux les performances individuelles des chars.
The Leclerc's powerful 120mm gun offers certain advantages over the current system. France pioneered the autoloader, and the AMX Leclerc will be the first Western European main battle tank to include this feature.
Il y a deux aspects dans la puissance de feu et la capacité de combattre du char. Il y a l'aspect purement arme-munition.
The firepower and fighting capability of a tank have two aspects. There is the tank gun itself, and there is the tank's ammunition. We have a much more powerful 120mm gun than current tanks. It has a 1 meter longer barrel, which gives the projectile greater speed and gives it more impact. The second aspect of its firepower is its ability to engage continuously, whether it's day or night, whether it's from the halter on the move with the same degree of effectiveness. This is possible because of the automatic loader. It's not affected by the movement of the tank, and so it can be used without having to halt the vehicle. It's also helped by the sophisticated fire control system and an electric turret drive, which allows very precise stabilization. All of these features give us similar results, whether the tank is moving or stationary.
Tout ceci est un ensemble, un système qui permet d'avoir en marche à peu près les mêmes performances que celles dont on dispose à l'arrêt.
The Leclerc is the latest chapter in France's innovations in tank design. During the Gulf crisis of 1991, the AMX-30 figured prominently in the fighting. The AMX-30 formed the basis of many tank units in the Gulf, including Saudi Arabian and Qatari tank units. During the January Iraqi offensive against the Saudi town of Khafji, Qatari units played a critical role in repulsing their attacks. The rapid and bloody riposte of this attack was the last offensive action by the Iraqi forces during the war. In western Saudi Arabia, French troops of the Daguet Force prepared to assist the multinational coalition in the liberation of Kuwait. Among the armored units in Saudi Arabia was the 4th Dragoon Regiment, equipped with the AMX-30 B-2 tanks. Here, the 4th Regiment conducts desert training maneuvers days before the Desert Storm offensive against Iraq.
Deux colonnes, un sub devant.
The French role in the Desert Storm offensive was to serve as the left flank of the multinational forces, rapidly sweeping north into Iraq. The French forces protected other coalition units from Iraqi units located further to the north and west. The French objective was to capture the key airfields, such as As-Salman, and the eventual blocking of Iraqi routes of escape. The French mission was entirely successful. The 4th Regiment encountered Iraqi tank units on the outskirts of As-Salman Air Base, and a short but violent battle ensued. From the muddy trenches of the Western Front in World War I to the rocky deserts of Western Iraq in the Gulf War, French tanks have been in the forefront of the armored vanguard.